Hello. Let's take a look how usage of local state is different from reagent and UIx, just to understand how local state and ratoms in reagent translate to UIx or React. How is it different and what are the similarities? So I have a UX component and reagent component. They are empty and already rendered. So let's make a counter, for example. So we'll make two buttons to decrement and increment the number, and then also render the number. And then I will do the same in UX. Okay, button, decrement, increment, and then a span to render a number, right? So now we have two counters, so I'll make it larger, right? Okay, well, maybe we can do something like a slight margin here. Okay, so they're not interactive, and in order to make those counters interactive, we want to introduce state to maintain the number, right? So in reagent, there are many ways to do it. So probably the most common one is to create a local var and close over it in a return function. We'll call it state, and we will use a ratom. Right, and here we will deref the ratom, and on click we will decrement the ratom. So and then here we want to increment. Right, let's see this one. Yeah, it works. Okay. So the other way, which I don't know, maybe the callback one, like not the callback, but the, what do you call it? Like the closure is not the most common one, but I don't like the fact that I have to write like the anonymous function thingy. So I prefer to use wizlet macro. Looks a little bit cleaner, and yeah, it's basically the same. It has the same behavior. Like the bindings here are evaluated only once when the component is created. So it's not only for state, you can put arbitrary code there, but since it's wizlet, it's meant to be used for creating something only once when component mounts into the DOM. So in UIx and like in typical React applications, you would use a hook, and it is called useState, which takes initial value similar to a ratom, but it returns a tuple. A tuple contains current state value and an updater function. And so when I want to render the value, I will just put the value, and when I want to decrement it, I will do onClick, set value, and pass a function. And then the same we'll do for incrementing the value, right? Right here, increment, right? Let's have a look if it works. Yeah, it works. Same way as the reagent app. So let's take a closer look. So first of all, the simplest way to use a state updater function in useState hook is to actually pass a new value. So we could do something like decrement the current value. So this looks more like reset when you work with atoms, because you reset current state value to a new value directly. But if you want to update, you can just pass a function. So that's similar to how swap works. In this case, swap is a separate function, but that takes a immutable container and atom. But with useState hook, you get an updater function itself. You don't have to pass. There's basically no mutable container at all. You only get an updater function and current state value. That's it. And normally in React, like that's all you can do. Either pass a new value or pass a function that will update the value. But in UIx, since I really like the pattern with swap that you can pass more arguments here, for example, to update nested value, I also kind of decorated the updater function of useState hook to follow the signature of swap function. So let's say that we have a nested value. Like, for example, we can have multiple use states per component, but it's also fine to just put them in a single map. It doesn't really matter, like however you want to do it. So we can assign x to 0, for example, and let's do the same in reagent component, right? And then when we want to render the value, we would read x, of course, here, and then when we want to update x, we would swap state update x decrement, right, and like here. And then for UIx component with useStateHook, we would do the same for state updater function. I would say update x decrement, update x increment. And then, of course, we want to read x from the state value, which is a map in this case. Let's see if it works. Still works for reagent, still works for UIx. Right? Okay. And yeah, now if we want to have some kind of global state, maybe because we just want it to be global, or because we want to share it between multiple components, in reagent, it is as simple as just moving this ratum into reagent state global var, and then we can get rid of wizlet. I will update variable names, and it works, right? Okay. In UIx, obviously we have to get rid of useState. Let's introduce UIx state variable and create just a regular ClojureScript atom, sorry. And then instead of useState, we will use atom hook. So this doesn't exist in React because in JavaScript there are no atoms baked into the language. So this is a ClojureScript specific atom that I introduced recently into the library, just for the sake of being able to quickly create some kind of global state and use it. So useAtom takes a reference like a global var where you store an atom, and then it returns just a value, a current state value of the atom. And then if you want to update it, you go with normal Clojure functions and update the value. Let's see if it works. So sorry, we have to put x here. Okay, so for UIx it works. Right. So that's it. Like, it's quite similar, just API is a little bit different, right? In reagent, you have to use reagent atom for local and global state. Of course, if we're not talking about reframe, but we'll talk about it in next videos. And in UIx, you either use useStateHook or useAtomHook. And the signature of state updater function is the same as swap function in ClojureScript standard library.